Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our third Pave the Way virtual session. My name is Heather Hudson. I'm the Director of Policy and Planning at the Washington Student Achievement Council, also known as WASAC, and we're thrilled to have you join us this morning. We are here for an exciting presentation from the OECD on labor market relevance and outcomes of higher education in Washington State. We are going to spend just a few minutes making sure folks understand who the Washington Student Achievement Council is before we jump into the presentation. A few notes on housekeeping is that this is a recorded session from 9 to 10:30 a.m. We'll be posting this on our website afterwards. We will hopefully have everybody muted throughout the session, but really want to encourage, if you have questions, to please chat them throughout the session today, and we will have plenty of time to get to your questions for the panelists after the initial presentation. And we encourage you to keep your videos on so that our panelists can see your faces. If you're in that place this morning and are able to do that, we welcome that, and if not, we also understand. So with that, Crystal, if I could have you pull up our slides, we will get started. So for those of you that are familiar with the Washington Student Achievement Council, we are responsible for leading statewide policy and strategic planning for the state to improve educational outcomes for students. We administer state financial aid, the Washington College Grant, the College Bound Scholarship, and many others. And we also oversee program and practice that helps support students' college access and completion, including access to FAFSA financial aid application, as well as federal programs like the Gear Up program. Next slide, Crystal. We do have a council with 9 members and an executive director, Michael Miotti. Our council is inclusive of the higher education sectors, including the 4-year privates, 4-year publics, and the 2-year community and technical colleges, as well as the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction with Superintendent Chris Rachel. The other members of our council are appointed by the governor, and we are, as I mentioned, in charge of overseeing kind of broad strategic planning for the state, specifically focused on increasing post-secondary attainment for students. So with that, I'd like to introduce our keynote presenters today. We are thrilled to have Patricia Mengel. She's the lead higher education analyst at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, also known as OECD. Patricia leads projects on labor market relevance and outcomes of higher education system reform, and the digitalization of higher education. Most recently, she worked leading the publication of the study, Labor Market Relevance and Outcomes, in 4 US states, Ohio, Texas, Virginia, and Washington. Prior to this, she worked at the OECD Center for Skills, conducting analysis and country work to help governments and stakeholders work together to strengthen national skill systems. We also have Thomas Wecko, Senior Policy Analyst at Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. Thomas Wecko is a senior analyst, and he oversees the higher education policy team. He's been responsible for reviews focused on higher education, working most recently with Portugal, Brazil, Mexico, Finland, and Lithuania. Prior to joining the OECD in 2015, he served as research manager for higher education at the American Institutes for Research, director of the Policy Planning and Studies Service in the US Department of Education, and associate commissioner for post-secondary adult and career education at the US National Center for Education Statistics. And he does have some strong roots back to Washington State. So happy to have you, Thomas. So I will hand it off to these incredible research leaders to share their findings and information on the report that they did here in Washington. Thank you. Go ahead, Patricia and Thomas.
Great. Who has the slides? There we are. You can skip to the next slide. Great. So I don't know if you know who we are as an organization. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development is an organization that has 37 member countries, one of which happily is the United States. And what we do is we work together with the governments of those 37 countries, building data that is comparable so they can understand and compare their performance one to another. We work setting voluntary standards in many fields, banking and product fields. In education, we do a lot of work helping countries compare themselves to one another through things like PISA, the assessment of 15-year-olds around the world, and other kinds of large-scale assessments and surveys. And we also work with governments trying to give them useful advice, much of which comes through sort of peer learning activities. And this is one of those projects. And we were delighted to have the United States participate. So very quickly today, we're going to share with you the results of one of those projects, which was a look at the labor market relevance and outcomes of higher education in 4 states. That was done in collaboration with the Lumina Foundation and involved, as you can see, Ohio, Texas, Virginia, and Washington. That was done pre-COVID. The world has changed. And part of what we'll be talking to you about today is both what we found prior to COVID and what this means in an era of post-COVID. Next slide, please. So the project that we have, that we conducted in the United States and have done in other countries, Norway, Mexico, and now a set of 4 countries in Europe, looks at the question of the alignment of higher education to labor markets. Obviously, this is a concern that's shared across, it's in Washington, it's across the United States, and it's across all of our member countries. You know that there is concern on the part of policymakers and families, right? That maybe graduates take a long time to enter into secure employment, that many graduates don't end up in so-called graduate level jobs, that there can be in cases study fields where there's a really significant oversupply of graduates. In some countries, you know, up to half of graduates are in law and business management. Whereas in other areas, in some of the STEM fields, there are really extensive shortages. And we know that graduates don't always have the level of skill or the kinds of skills developed and cultivated in their study programs that employers think they need. And while there's certainly many responsibilities of higher education systems, helping learners develop durable skills that will permit them to have a lifetime of rewarding employment is in fact one of the things that we hope they do, both because that helps them meet the cost of college and it also furnishes them with a lifetime of opportunity and security. So next slide, please. So how do we go about thinking about and understanding the question of alignment between higher education provision and labor market? That's really a sort of a 2-stage process, right? And it's of course familiar to you as well as it is to us. And the first part of that involves asking the question, how well is the graduate supply meeting labor market needs? And that's where we spend time looking carefully at the evidence of labor market outcomes. Those are rates of employment, earnings, wage premia, wage progression, right? So we work with national data and where possible international data to understand the experience of graduates as they enter into labor market. We also talk to employers themselves And while one has to be careful because those aren't all scientific samples, it's important to also to take some measure of how they understand the skills of graduates and the sort of the sufficiency of those skills to meet the demands and to grow in their working life. So the first step of that is looking at those data and having those conversations. And the second step then is trying to sort of take a step back and look at the policies that states, or in some countries, the national governments have in place to support a proper alignment between the offer of higher education institutions and the demands of the labor market. That requires, I think, an exercise of judgment. We work across 37 countries, and we develop a lot of experience working with countries. And insights, of course, that you would perhaps share yourself about the relationship between the information policies, the labor market information policies, the funding policies that are put in place by governments, and what kinds of incentives and capabilities that creates on the part of higher education institutions to respond to labor market demand. Obviously, when we work with countries that have historic budget models, right, that fund institutions on the basis of the prior year of funding, plus or minus 5%, we understand that generates very weak incentives for the institutions to focus on labor market outcomes. And where those institutions don't have access to good information about the labor market experience of graduates, then we have two problems. One is information and one is incentives. So as we make assessments of how well functioning the policies are in supporting those incentives and capabilities of institutions, we draw upon that international experience. Okay, next slide. And Patricia will take it from here.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today virtually. I've met a few of you in the spring of 2019 when I was in the state of Washington. It's been a while, things have changed, but it's a pleasure to be here today and to share some of the insights that we have found in our study, as well as talk to you a little bit about why these matter today in the new context we face. Next slide, please. So to begin, when we conducted this study, the labor market was particularly tight in Washington state. This was true in the rest of the US, but in Washington really in particular. There was low unemployment and pressures in many occupations. Here, what you can see in this slide is data that was compiled by WASAC, the SBCTC, and the Workforce Training Board in Washington from 2016, looking at the gaps that emerged between projected job openings over 2020 to 2025 and the current supply at the time of graduates in the state at different levels of skill. What is interesting here on this slide is that we focus on the mid-level, people with an associate or certificate, and people at the bachelor level. And what you can see there is that the demand exceeded supply in pretty much the majority of the occupations on the slide. And you can see very large gaps in computer and information science and service occupations at the mid-level of skill, and at the computer science, in the computer science occupation for bachelor degrees. So these were large gaps. And the question now is, what do we have today? So I'm going to go to the next slide, please. Now, what does this all mean when we are today in a very different economic and labor market situation with a large impact from COVID? So this is a picture that is coming from the most recent update that was produced in Washington about essentially the demand, looking at online job postings across a number of occupations at different levels. So here, what you can see in this slide is that across production and trade jobs at the mid-level, ICT jobs at the bachelor level, and engineering jobs at a graduate level, in all cases, you see a very steep fall in job openings. And of course, we also know that hospitality has been hit hard. And that was one where we saw a lot of demand actually at the mid-level of skill. So this is probably also an area being struggling today, where graduates are struggling today. We don't know, however, how quickly these jobs may recover. And this depends on many factors. Of course, decisions from the public health authorities about opening the economy and to what extent, but also about employer expectations around the speed and the scale of recovery. Next slide, please. So another finding in our report, in addition to those big shortages at the time, was really to look at the educational pipeline and how skills are being produced through the education system and the post-secondary education system in particular in Washington. So what we found is an interesting contrast. On the one hand, Washington has a well-educated working age population. And at the same time as it has a very well-educated working age population, there are concerns about the interest of the younger generation and its ability to pursue post-secondary education. So I'm just starting here with the attainment rate. So for the working age people, 25-64, we see that the attainment rate, the degree attainment rate is higher than the US average. We also see something quite interesting, which is that Washington has a high attainment of short-term labor market relevant credentials. That's something that Lumina Foundation is tracking. And it's interesting because it's actually higher in Washington than in the rest of the US. However, despite the high attainment rate, you can see quite important differences by demographics, and here on the slide, geographically. You see, for example, that King County has an attainment of 60%, over 60%, but this is only 24% in Yakima. This is no surprise to you, but I think it's important to kind of, again, here, go beyond the averages. Now, looking at the question of young people going to post-secondary education, what we see is that in this metric, Washington is actually below the US average. Only about 35% of the 18-24 are going to college versus 40% in the US. And the other issue that we point out in our report is that while completion rates of all types of post-secondary programs tend to be a little bit better in Washington than in the rest of the country, there is still a lot to do there. A lot of people fall off while they are in post-secondary programs. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm now going to go through all of these figures here. This is basically a small snapshot of a scorecard that we created in the report where we aim to compare the 4 participating states against each other on key labor market outcomes, as well as with international jurisdictions for which we have data, OECD data. So what I just want to point out here is specific to Washington, and it's really our third finding, is that graduates do well in the labor market, but not all of them do. And the disparities in outcomes are in fact greater in Washington and in other parts of the US. So what you can see here is that in 2018, which is the date of this data, about 87% of people with a bachelor degree in Washington in the age group 25-34 were employed, and that's a bit above the US average. So they were doing well. But the people with an associate degree in Washington, actually they had an employment rate 4 percentage points below the US rate. And the people with some college and no degree, which we know there are many of, and these often include people with certificates or industry certifications, they also were slightly less employed than in the US. If you look at the second part of the slide, which is about earnings, median earnings, the difference is also quite important. You see bachelor graduates earning 66% more than people with upper secondary education. So that's a fairly good premium, which is in fact slightly above the US premium. But people with an associate degree, here again, they earn only about 11% more than people with upper secondary. Of course, we understand that there's a lot of factors influencing those figures, and the minimum wage is one that makes a big impact on the premium. But it is important to observe the difference in the outcomes that people can get depending on the kind of degree they have or the kind of program they've completed. Next slide, please. Okay, now what drives those differences is a complicated question. Many characteristics can be associated with difference in outcomes. In the report, we look at the level of study, which I just did in the previous slide. We look in depth at the field of study because this is a major driver of differences. And we look at student demographics to really understand what are the profiles of students that do well and those that do not as well after they complete post-secondary education. And of course, again, many factors are at play. They have impacts on each other. It's complicated, but one thing that I want to point out and that we discuss in the report is that the choice of program that people pursue, again, the field of study has a major impact on earnings and employment. And in the slide, you can see that students of different backgrounds make different choices, with Asian and white students being many to choose high-earning fields like computer science, whereas a large share of Black and Hispanic students choose fields that are in high demand, that are critical to society, like education, but that command lower earnings. And when you look at gender, you see a kind of a similar picture emerging, where you see that men are much more likely to choose computer science, a high-earning field, and women are much more likely to choose education and men. So this might be one of the important drivers in terms of the difference in outcomes. Next slide, please. So these are three important findings that we have documented in the report. And what we've done after observing these elements is that we looked at what the state is doing in terms of policies and what could be improved in those policies to help align the supply of graduates and the demands of employers, and really help all graduates have better outcomes. Because again, one of the key takeaway in the state of Washington is that there, at a time, and I'm sure it will return to this, a great economy offers a lot of opportunity for graduates, but not all could take advantage of it. So next slide, please. I'm now going to move to show you really briefly, you can see the report, our series of recommendations. And for each area of recommendation, I've grouped our recommendations in themes so they're a little bit easier to digest for this conversation today. So the first one is about strategic planning and coordination. And that's the role really that state authorities have to help all actors in the system work together. Our first block of recommendation really, and that's actually the first recommendation, is about focusing the attention of stakeholders on labor market relevance of higher education. What we observe across the 4 states is that attainment targets have been a major engine for all stakeholders to try and increase the number of people accessing and completing higher education. But the same attention is not necessarily placed on labor market relevant higher education. So the first recommendation is to monitor the progress against some specific quantified metrics, and we suggest to use those of the Career Connect Washington initiative. Second block of recommendation has to do with monitoring the availability of labor market relevant opportunities and labor market relevant experiences. Recommendations 2 and 3 are about trying to obtain information from institutions in the kinds of programs they provide and from employers on the kinds of work-based learning opportunities they actually offer to students in the state. And here the idea is again to make sure that like the kinds of programs, the kinds of work-based learning that exist in the state is rich, is diverse, and is sufficient. The third block has to do with really understanding better and responding quicker to employer needs. And here we're talking about maybe continuing to improve the way we understand employer needs. As Thomas mentioned, we spoke to many employers during our project, but we are fully aware that this is not statistically significant samples, and we have to try and understand those employers a bit better. So we recommend an employer survey in our report. We also recommend to enhance the employer representation and participation in some of the planning bodies in the state. Finally, we are talking also quite substantially in the report about promoting the institutional focus on labor market relevance. And here we have 2 recommendations on a regular process to inform the legislature about how institutions meet labor market needs. And that's also their regional and local needs. And we propose, for example, institutional compacts that could help monitor and inform the legislature about how institutions do and how they're progressing on this goal of being relevant to the needs of their labor market. Next slide, please. Funding. That is a critical part of our recommendations. And here I divided it in 3 blocks. First off, it's extremely important to ensure that baseline institutional funding is sufficient despite the constraints that are in the current environment. And you know, when we did our study, funding had just started to recover close to the level it was pre-financial crisis. So around like the level of 2007. Now we know it is a very difficult goal, but we think it's particularly important, particularly for community and technical colleges. And here the idea is to sustain or improve funding, to improve quality of instruction, the quality of student supports, raise faculty salaries in shortage fields, and invest in faculty professional development. We also suggest in our report to orient funding toward labor market relevance and to craft, to embed incentives in the way funding is being utilized. We have a recommendation on including labor market metrics, considering their inclusion in the Student Achievement Initiative, which is the performance model in the college system. We have a recommendation on targeted funds to help institutions meet short-term labor market needs. And we have a recommendation which is about considering disclosure of metrics such as debt loads and labor market outcomes of graduates from institutions that have a large share of students who are supported by financial aid. Why this recommendation? Is because we know that in a state like Washington, much of the public support comes in the form of student aid. So we suggest that because we think it's important that that state investment not only contributes to access to higher education, but also to labor market relevant higher education. Finally, back to the point Thomas was making around incentives, we think incentives can be really carefully used, in particular to support vulnerable students. That's a major challenge in all of the OECD countries we work with. And our recommendation 5 is on trying to craft them to incentivize the completion among low-income disadvantaged students. And recommendation 6 is not just actually about the financial benefits that are being offered, but also the coordination and streamlining of those benefits, particularly for disadvantaged adults that can access lots of benefits, but sometimes have a hard time navigating and understanding those. Next slide, please. Moving to our recommendations on the educational offering, these I've got here two main areas. The first one is very much connected to something I discussed before, which is to again monitor and improve the take-up of work-based learning and work-relevant skills. This is something that we think is particularly important, and we're again talking about monitoring closely the take-up. This time it's not just the supply of career-connected learning, but it's also the take-up. And here it's important to have institutions be part of that effort to see, well, what is the share of students and in what programs that are actually pursuing work-based learning. We also have a recommendation on expanding the work-study program, which is targeted to lower income students. We have a recommendation on using targeted funding tools to incentivize faculty industry links. And there again, we're really trying to focus on expanding work-based learning opportunities in those fields that are not professionally oriented, where we saw in the state there were less opportunities, and also to try and diversify the types of work-based learning offered, including by small companies. The second area in the educational offering really is about expanding the types of labor market relevant pathways that exist. And this is something we saw quite a lot of innovation in Washington State, actually. But we think, for example, like it's good to keep exploring and expanding the models that work. For example, the innovative apprenticeship models in our third recommendation merits consideration for expansion, given the very good outcomes this type of pathway provides. Our fourth recommendation is on piloting projects with professional regulatory bodies and employers to think about new types of programs that may respond to changing needs. And here we think also of micro-credentials, short opportunities that a lot of people might be interested in this current economic context, where they may not have the financial means to engage into a longer program. So here there's an opportunity for new types of programs to be thought about in partnership with employers. And finally, one important role for the state, if new pathways are being created, is to monitor and recognize their quality. And we're particularly concerned in this area around micro-credentials because a lot of them are emerging. And the question here is, how can learners know and employers know which ones are actually of good quality? Next slide, please. Student supports and pathways. This is something that when we spoke to Washington stakeholders, came up as one of the major areas for improvement. This is quite interesting because there are a lot of evidence-based supports being used. The question is scaling up, and that's not unique to Washington, but it is important in Washington. Our first recommendation focuses on guided pathways and continuing to support this robust program. And our fourth recommendation focuses on trying to experiment with nudging programs that are designed to increase the transition from a post-secondary to post-secondary, and that helps retain underrepresented groups. Also, another block of recommendations have to do with understanding the student transitions and motivations. Our second recommendation is about a study of underrepresented students earlier in their educational pathways and in their first year of post-secondary education. Because here again, the state does a lot, as put forward a generous student aid package, but still many underrepresented students choose not to transition. Understanding what motivates them is really critical. The third block here is about the supports and the pathways and their usage. It's one thing to have them, but the other thing is that students can use those. So we're suggesting to map the supports, first of all, have an understanding of what they are, find overlaps and gaps. We recommend to have targeted funding to actually help in high school, to help with high school guidance so that people know what kinds of supports are available to them and use them. And we recommend to really have a strong focus on credit transfer. The state is doing a lot in this area, and we think that monitoring the take-up of the credit transfer opportunities, particularly by underrepresented group, is one avenue that's worth exploring. Articulation agreements are statewide would help students, and it would also help them if they could understand how they could move between post-secondary opportunities and career and technical education, because that's those pathways can be quite difficult. And finally, having a centralized database of credit transfer opportunities. I know the state is doing a lot of efforts on this front, but we think it would be a helpful way for students, whether they're young or whether they're adults, to understand how they can move inside the system. And the next slide, please. That's the last one. The last area is information. Of course, information is a critical area where a lot has been done by the state. More can still be done. So first, the availability of labor market outcomes data can still be improved. And this can be done in particular by disaggregating data at program level and by subpopulation and local area. It would also be useful to expand the data that is available about private institutions, because they don't have, of course, the same data asked from the state as public institutions, but it would be useful to know more. And the second recommendation is about exploring the opportunity of having a graduate survey that could help understand in-field placement and assess the use of skills that people have acquired on the job. And in our report, we provide some examples of other countries like Australia or the UK that have been taking this approach, and actually that have, in Australia, for example, linked together employer surveys and graduate surveys that could be interesting for Washington. Now, the second area, and I think it's the one that is worth insisting on, is making information user-friendly and focusing on whether it's actually being used and by the people that need it the most. So our third recommendation there is on creating a single supply and demand dashboard that would consolidate some of the great data that's already there from the SBCTC Workforce and Supply Demand Dashboard and WASAC Roadmap. A lot of great information in there is there. Consolidating it would make it that much more user-friendly. We also suggest, which you do in your publication, to leverage real-time job postings data and perhaps to use some of that real-time job postings data to communicate more to the public. And we also recommend to consolidate the tools that are like many at the moment in one platform that would be carefully designed to meet the needs of different users, different learners of different profiles and maybe interested in different information, and also to improve the transparency of the information, making it easier to understand and more user-friendly. And there again, in our report, we have some examples of jurisdictions that you might be able to learn from that have done a lot of work to make the information more user-friendly. And I'm thinking in particular of the Netherlands, as well as some Nordic countries that have done well in this area. And moving now, please, to the next slide. Next. Okay, why should we care about all of this in COVID times, you might ask? The key question here and the key concern that we have is that all of the areas of gaps that we've identified in our report may simply widen. And you might see that sort of at two levels. First of all, in higher education, we talked about the pipeline and the issues of people not going to higher education or dropping out of higher education. Well, in a hybrid and online model of learning, you might see some students that are well prepared do well, and those who are not well prepared and face disadvantage actually suffer the most. So there's an issue there in potential widening of gaps in the educational pipeline itself. Then in the labor market, we might also see an expansion of gaps, and that's because maybe there will be a fast return to growth in some high demand occupations. We can think of some of the currently hard-hit ICT occupations. They have a potential to keep growing as the economy continues to digitalize. But then for people, for graduates that have skills that perhaps they are not exactly fitted to the labor market needs of employers, or that they are not able to really explain to employers, the uncertainty is large, and it is possible to see some of those disappointing outcomes be even more problematic in the years to come for those particular students. Next, please. So our message really in COVID times is that it's a time that requires integrated state action and actual collaboration, stronger collaboration with all actors. Here we first talk about greater coordination by design between higher education and the workforce policies. We can imagine many adults losing their jobs and needing to upskill and reskill in the month and the years to come. So making sure the pathways for learners are actually easy to navigate, they are clear, and they are utilized is extremely important. Second area is making sure that there is greater labor market readiness and transferable skills for all graduates. Here again, some graduates are very well positioned, others are less so. Similar idea here is to ensure that like when people acquire those transferable and labor market relevant skills, they are doing so in programs that are high quality. And as micro-credentials are likely to expand in number in the coming months and years, we think ensuring quality is one area where state authorities can play a role. Finally, I'll close on the sustained financial support to learners and institutions as something that, again, we understand the constraints on budgets are extreme, but this is important to avoid seeing, problem of quality and equity worsen. And the next slide, please. Here's just a snapshot. I will leave you with this. Like Thomas said, we work with 37 countries across the OECD. We had the pleasure of working with 4 US states in this particular project. And there are a lot of examples that can be useful questions to learn from. I put here examples from Texas and Ohio around coordination between state agencies to make smoother pathways between education, higher education, and the workforce. I have an example here from Virginia, which is about their tech talent pipeline and how they are expanding rapidly the supply of skills towards the high demand area. I have an example from Canada, where Canada has a lot of interesting insights for a state like Washington, whether it is about the funding approach to community colleges, or it's about the way of conceptualizing labor market information and focusing on the use of labor market information. We have examples from the Netherlands around a integrated student-focused career choice website. And from Australia, like I said, about an employer satisfaction survey, which would be interesting to better understand the needs of Washington employers. And I think that is it for me. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just the references here for you. You can see the report and where you can find it online, and 3 working papers that we have completed in our team recently that speak to issues that you might find interesting. The emergence of alternative credentials that was published in March, the role of labor market information in guiding educational and occupational choices, that's recent from October, and an analysis, what do employers seek in graduates using burning less data, and that's also from October. So thanks very much for your attention, and I will look forward to the next presentation and discussion with you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Thomas. Wow, so much rich information. We have about 20 minutes or so now that I'm gonna introduce our next folks here from Washington State to respond to some of the information that you just heard. So we have two folks here that are going to offer some comments and thoughts. We have Hart Hodges, Director of the Center for Economic and Business Research at Western Washington University. Dr. Hodges is an Associate Professor of Economics at Western Washington, where he serves as a Director of the university's Center for Economic and Business Research. In addition to his work at the university, Hart is a registered investment advisor and president of Waycross Investment Management Company. His research focuses on natural resource economics and environmental policy, health economics, regional economics, and is working on projects that focus on tax reform and healthcare finance. We also have Kevin Perky, Chief Executive Officer of Workforce Southwest Washington. This group leads the public workforce system for Clark, Cowlitz, and oh my gosh, I don't know how to pronounce this county, Wahkiakum counties, including oversight of work source and job training programs for ages 16 to 24. This group contributes to regional economic growth by investing in federal, state, local, and private funds into programs and community-based organizations that improve the skills and education of our local workforce and provide companies with qualified talent. Prior to joining this, the Workforce Southwest Washington, Kevin was the CEO of South Central Pennsylvania Works, a regional workforce development board investing more than $12 million across the counties there. Kevin serves as a chair of the Washington Workforce Association and on the boards of the Columbia River Economic Development Council and the Cowlitz Economic Development Council. And he's on a bunch of other boards and committees that I'm not going to name because, oh my gosh, Kevin, I don't know how you have time for any of this. With that introduction, Hart, I'm going to start with you. Can you share your perspective coming from a higher ed institution, responding to the information that Patricia and Thomas have shared around the labor market alignment in higher ed here in Washington State?
Sure. So Heather and Isaac, everybody, thanks for having me. I may sound a little bit schizophrenic as I offer a few thoughts, and partly to respond, but also to set the stage for some of the discussion we're going to have afterwards, because it's easy for me to highlight things that we're doing in higher ed, trying to coordinate with employers. We have advisory boards. We work with employers, whether they're alumni boards or just employers that want to work with college students and want to help us adjust our curriculum. On the other hand, knowing what students really need to be successful, whether that's in getting a job or being successful in their first job, I don't think is as obvious as we might think. I'll return to that in just a second. Patricia's already mentioned a couple of things. She was mentioning funding, and I think that's going to be crucial because just at Western, we have several different colleges going through a curriculum review, asking how do we help our students, our graduates, be more professionally ready? What changes do we need to the courses we offer? What additional counseling is needed, and so on and so forth. And that's great, but at the moment, those are just ideas without any funding to make them happen. Okay. So I can go back and forth between we're doing this, but I've still got questions and I don't know how much progress we're really making. And maybe I can highlight that because we've got, 80 something people participating in this this webinar. And I think if we had everybody write down 2 or 3 things that they thought colleges should do to make sure that graduates have the skills employers need, or to ensure that graduates are professionally ready, I think we get a very long list without a lot of agreement, surprisingly, because some people would focus on the skills needed for certain jobs. Somebody else would say, no, the specific skills change. I'll say something about COVID, right? Because what jobs that are available right now need or require is different than what the jobs that were more available last February required. So that person might say, no, the job skills really change. So I'm going to write down things about making sure students know how to learn and to be flexible. Someone might focus on the soft skills, communication and writing, attitude, the approach to work. Somebody else might focus on STEM and the need for skilled and ability with software packages, and so on and so forth. Somebody else might say, we need kids to have an appreciation for diversity and equity, and that's important in the workplace. I could go on, right? So getting that focus or having some priorities is going to be really important. I'm supposed to comment a little bit on COVID as well. And I think in general, COVID highlights challenges. And like so many things, COVID has not created a new problem so much as accelerated or magnified existing ones. And what we're seeing with the job market right now, that's true again. We often look at data on job postings. What are the types of jobs and what are the skills that are being advertised, and what does that say about the labor market? And we help with technical and community colleges to digest that data, but we also try to use it at the four-year institutions. But that rapid change that we've seen over the last 6 months, I think, is a reminder that the job market has a certain dynamic, and four-year institutions, colleges, don't necessarily move with that dynamic. And we have to keep that in mind. I think COVID has also reminded us that students have to be flexible. In February, we had seniors that were excited about their job prospects, were looking forward to the interviews and the networking, and bam, then they had to think about networking and interviewing in a Zoom session. And they hadn't thought about, well, how do I make sure that the lighting is appropriate? What background do I use? What, so on and so forth, right? Different world. We've got to be flexible, but getting back to focusing on higher ed, professional readiness in general, I hope we can talk a little bit more today and work with the Achievement Council and Patricia and Michael, and because we do need to keep asking, is the core of what we teach, does it have the right material in it? And then the things that we add on top of that core, is that material in line with what employers really want today? One of the things that Patricia was talking about at the end about the alignment, promoting institutional focus on labor market relevance. I think it's critical. I love that point. I think it's critical that we get employer views and needs to students early. I'm going to say in K-12. I hear about students all the time saying, well, I finished Algebra 1, don't have to take math ever again. Maybe, but why don't they look at posts from someone at Tableau or Amazon or a whole host of employers? That information should be easy to communicate. And so getting that alignment is not just getting the faculty to teach something, it's also getting the students to want to learn it. Students in college often bump up against, wait, I'm already 2 years into this degree, and now I'm learning that I have to take math. And it's not that the pathways are that complicated so much students don't pay attention to them early, and they don't want to pivot and go back and take courses in some of them areas that they thought they had already put behind them. I'm talking too long. One last thing, then really quickly, and then I'll hand it back to Heather. Patricia highlighted several recommendations from the report. One was promoting institutional focus, and that really resonated with me. So I wanted to highlight one more need, which is coordinating with faculty. You can't just say from Olympia, the four-year institutions, thou shalt do X, Y, and Z, because you've got a lot of faculty in different disciplines, different colleges. They own the curriculum in some sense. It's their classes. And so there's got to be some work with faculty to get faculty tuned into this need for labor market relevance. And that's going to take a little bit of work to get people from English or history to work with that mindset. So I'll stop there because I know we've got time for Q&A in a little bit. I hope I've said something that.
Thank you, Hart. Yeah, no, that was great. And we will have time. If you haven't chatted your question in, Crystal is monitoring the chat and we're collecting those, and we're going to get to your questions here momentarily. So please keep putting in your questions. So we're going to turn to Kevin. Kevin, we've heard about the data and we've heard about this system alignment. How, from an employer perspective, how do we know if our higher education systems, our academics, the skills and education that our institutions are working to do, how do we know if that's actually meeting the employer and industry demand beyond looking at the data? What do you see from where you sit, and how is that changing in response to COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Heather, and thank you everyone for including me today. I greatly appreciate it, and it's a great question. And if we have employer partners on, I apologize, but I'm going to let everybody in on a little secret that we've learned. Employers don't know everything they need to know when it comes to what they're looking for. When we look at job postings, when we look at matching that with the actual job that they're looking for, there's often a disconnect there too. So it is a very complicated and complex situation. But let me offer a couple of quick points, and then and I'm trying to tie this to the relevance of what we see today. And we see continued business interest as much as and I appreciate the research insights were spot on and sort of helped echoes what we see locally in our market in Southwest Washington and across my colleagues, all 12 of us in the state of Washington, as well as workforce development leaders. Our business community does continue to express interest in, understanding how university partners can help with more short-term training. I think Dr. Hodges, you alluded to this sort of, or Thomas or Patricia said something about like the rapid adjustment of higher ed to meet local labor market demands. That idea, I think that the sentiment from the private sector is rapid and higher ed doesn't always go together in the same sort of sentence. And I think we sense that through workforce development boards. And how do we quickly, especially in times of COVID, when in Southwest Washington in particular, pre-COVID, we had, I think, about 2,000 or 3,000 people on the unemployment rolls at any given time. Now we're up to 20,000. So in a 3-county region, we have 20,000 individuals that are trying to transition into potentially some new skill sets, some new line of work, particularly coming from the retail, hospitality, and restaurant fields. And what might that look like? And how quickly can they get back into the labor market, into a high quality job? And higher ed is certainly a pathway there, but I think there is a timing issue there as well. And I think your report rightfully sort of highlighted some of that when it came to the wages and the time and the student debt load that you would take on to getting there. So I think that sort of continuum of the value proposition is something that weighs on the employer mind too. We do see increased interest, at least pre-COVID, and we're continuing to see interest here as well, excuse me, amongst our employer partners around cohort-led training. So if we had an industry, companies within the same industry, let's say some small manufacturing in Southwest Washington, interested in how they could get CNC skill sets for individuals, whether that be through a community college or even, we're working very closely with our Washington State University Vancouver campus on how we explore some of these short-term hard skill development opportunities for us as well. I do want to also just hit on one piece, and I appreciate Savannah's sort of monitoring the chat here when it comes to our BIPOC communities that are traditionally, have been traditionally marginalized. There's a component here that we're trying to figure out in the workforce development world as well, and that's really building meaningful professional social capital. I think if I were to ask everybody here on this screen, you may have pursued higher education, but how did you get your first job? How did you get your second job? How did you get your promotion? And I'm willing to put my salary on it that it was through some network that you have. And I think Dr. Hodges actually mentioned a little bit there about like the complexity now with COVID, and in a virtual environment, you're sitting in your house like I am, even though this is a blue screen. How do you continue to build meaningful professional social capital? And that's something I think that we all need to wrestle with. And how do we ensure that we're providing equitable social capital and creating that for communities that have been traditionally potentially left out of that access to some of these sort of through the gatekeepers into some of these fields. And I think that's a critical component that I think higher ed should wrestle with as someone goes through their college experience beyond just offering internships, which are absolutely critical. I know some of my Career Connect Washington STEM friends are on the call today. But how do you continue to nurture and build and help people understand how to build professional capital? I'm willing to bet that everybody on this Zoom call also struggles with continuing to uphold and build meaningful social capital, no matter where you are in your career. And we know that that's critical to advancement, not just the skill sets and the degree that you get. So I just want to put that in the room as well as a topic here. But I think from the, as we think about what's going on with COVID right now, looking out over the next few months for us as a workforce development agency, we're really talking about what does quality jobs look like? What does that framework begin to look like for individuals? How do we create an equitable economic recovery in our region, in our state? What role and how can we tap into the value proposition through folks like WSUB, Clark College, and others, and Lower Columbia Community College in our region? But what role do they play in helping to solve once our business community sort of settles a bit and there's some, God forbid we have some certainty, I think would be very welcome amongst our employer community right now. We could begin to plot, how do we transition individuals back into really meaningful work? So I'll sort of pause there, but it is I again, really appreciated the research. I think there's, to the point of the recommendations, there's a lot of really good fruit there for us to harvest as a state, and happy to be a part of the conversation today.
Thank you, Kevin. So before I open it up to the questions I know we've been getting in the chat, Patricia and Thomas, do you want to offer any additional comments or responses based off of what Kevin and Hart mentioned?
I think the questions have been terrific, and there's some really compelling questions that have been put to us, and it'd be great if we have a chance to get to those. Okay. And build back to the comments that you two have just made, because they were really, there's a lot to build upon there.
Okay, great. Well, Crystal, can you tell us what the first question was, and we can get right into it?
Sorry, Heather?
Yes.
Here, I wanted to say, just if it's easy from a logistical perspective, we have received the questions that were in the chat. So if you prefer that we just address some questions we saw coming, it might be easier than having Crystal read those out loud.
Great. Go ahead, Patricia.
Some rich comments there. So I want to start by addressing some of these questions. So I'm not going to get through all of them, and I think Thomas might also want to compliment. But just somebody has asked about the description of differences in careers across race as a choice. And you were wondering about whether we also studied aspects such as career tracking and discrimination. So I want to address this question because I think that many people have spoken actually about concerns around discrimination in the questions. The first aspect, and I know it's not very satisfying, is that the issues of institutionalized racism and discrimination are beyond our scope of analysis. But what I will say in response to that question around career choice according to race is that we are saying that the choice of study is only one aspect, but there are certainly other aspects, and particularly our choices being formed, whether social capital is sufficient, like was just said, is something that should be studied and understood by really understanding the individuals and their motivations. So that's where our recommendation on the study of underrepresented students, and of course that includes racial minorities, is important, because one of the issues that we found is like how to understand what those students actually want and why they choose what they choose, and if it's an issue of choice or an issue of ability. So this is something that we think is a way to address that. There was a question about incentives for, again, like low-income students to pursue a degree or credential, and whether those should actually cover basic needs or something more. So when we talk about incentives for vulnerable students to pursue higher education, we're talking about ensuring that the needs of the students are covered in a kind of comprehensive way. So there are programs that cover the tuition fees, the books and so on. There are programs that cover cost of living. And one important aspect, again, is to understand that the student has all of their needs covered and that they are able to pursue higher education in good conditions. So yes, the answer is we're talking about comprehensive supports, all the way from support that have to do with education directly to basic needs. I just want to pick up on one more, which was about whether we addressed the need for more teachers and education personnel that reflects the diversity of the student population. So one aspect, two things on this. I think we did find in our study that actually a lot of students of minority backgrounds choose education. That being said, there's still a big shortage of educators and teachers. And one aspect that we discussed in our report is the problem of understanding why people don't go to those particular fields. And one of them has to do often with the lower pay. But another area is to look at how to expand the supply of teachers and educators. And we look in particular at a pilot, which was organized by the Professional Educator Standards Boards. And that was essentially an attempt to develop alternative routes to certification, targeting people that are non-teaching staff in the educational system and people outside of education that may want to change career. And one idea behind this that we thought was interesting is that it could also not only diversify the professional profile of people coming to education, but maybe also simply the background of individuals that come to the profession. So that might be one way to indeed increase diversity in the teaching and educating workforce. Passing on to Thomas, if you have any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to make a confession. So this is a great learning opportunity for us to be sort of confronted with your questions. As an international organization, dealing with institutionalized racism and racial effects in steering in schooling into certain kinds of curricula, racial effects on the kinds of capital people have available to acquire work-based learning opportunities, and all of the questions you've put to us. I mean, those are things actually that we do very poorly. And it's worth recognizing, I think, for when you deal with people who are coming from an international setting. I mean, one of the ways in which we do a really bad job of that is because of the specificity of race. So, you know, if we're working with Mexico and the United States and France and Italy, and Canada, that sort of this race sort of is enacted and affects sort of all of this very differently across countries. I mean, it's really, it's very deep and specific, and it's hard oftentimes to get hold of it. The second is in ways that make sense. You almost need to be, you know, more anthropologists than people flying at 30,000 feet. Yeah. As you just mentioned in the case of teachers, but also in the case of many other things, we also tend to have much better data on things. You know, we write about things we can observe in our data. and our data are very thin on things that are racially relevant. And I think the other problem we have as an international organization is that we have 37 countries. And I'll just say there are countries who don't want to make, you know, the sort of deep racial inequalities that people are experiencing in some OECD countries a focus of our work. You know, I won't name those countries, but they're there. Some of those are in Europe and some of those are in East Asia. So it's hard for us to make that a priority, but it's good for us to be confronted, I think, with that, because that's, you know, we recognize that from the moment of birth through early childhood schooling choices and, you know, all of those, when we observe the differences in wages that people are experiencing at age 30, those are definitely the cumulative effect of all of that sort of racial weight that, frankly, we're not observing. So it's good for us to take that back home and think about what that means for the work we do. So thank you, because that's something where we need to do better. And just to follow on the point about Hart's observation about kind of shifting the focus from the student to the institution. As someone who was an academic in an institution, I do realize that a lot of people want to get this right. Like you were saying, my colleagues really do. They come to me and they have questions about this and they have a commitment to it. And you said something about resources. I mean, it takes time. Like, no one gave me course releases to go out and spend a lot of time sitting down with employers and trying to build meaningful work-based learning opportunities for my students, right? It takes a lot of resources for institutions. And as you say, Hart, it's not someone in Olympia saying this. I mean, ultimately, in the end, it's the entire instructional workforce that delivers the learning experience and has to own a commitment to this, right? So it has to kind of work its way down into the culture and habits of the organization. And unless people see that as a valued activity, rather than an article that they didn't get published. And
the reward system is for the publishing, not.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually did do some really fun and interesting things for students in the way of work-based learning when I was a university teacher. But that was totally that was like a sacrifice. I mean, no one rewarded me for that. It wasn't a recognized activity. It wasn't a funded activity. And those things really need to change if that's going to become part of it. We have countries in the OECD, in Finland and the Netherlands and other places that have really strong traditions in their University of Applied Science of having, a deep and comprehensive practice of, professional orientation and really high quality curriculum linked work-based learning. So there's some really nice models out there, but that takes a strong commitment both at the policy and the institution level to make that work. And that's hard, especially now when class sizes budgets are falling, class sizes are larger. So we appreciate the difficulty of that. Sorry, I went on too long.
That's all right. Thank you. We're here for the discussion, so please keep chatting in your questions. I want to kind of pose another question around the time that we are in, just take a deeper layer into the COVID-19 impact that we're seeing on students, acknowledging the disproportionate impact on students of color, and again, acknowledging that our systems and our higher ed institutions were not designed for all students. The historical racism that our institutions are still grappling with. So things like remote learning. How would you all respond to both the remote learning that our students are now kind of forced into, the remote learning that our higher ed institutions are needing to quickly offer? And Kevin, what is remote working or non-remote work? We know that there are jobs out there that you can't do remote work. You gotta go and you can't weld from your house. So kind of a question to all of you, and maybe Hart, we can start with you and the higher ed perspective. Patricia and Thomas, would love to hear from you around that kind of anticipating what's next in the labor market as we dig deeper into this uncertainty with COVID-19, but knowing that it's not going to end in a month or two. What does the future look like kind of for all of you, and how are your institutions, employers, your portfolio, like how are your constituents kind of grappling with this? So we'll start with you, Hart.
I think I'd rather go last with that question. I mean, we are planning to deal with some degree of remote learning through the spring and into summer. I mean, in anticipation that sure, a vaccine could become available, but when does it mean actually widely distributed, widely used, and so on and so forth. And the adult vaccine is different than a kid vaccine. So the disruptions to higher ed and K-12 will continue. So we have to think about remote learning and the different tools, mechanisms of delivery. You have to then be tuned into what challenges that presents, whether income level, geography, who's got broadband access, and then who learns in different ways. It's really quite challenging. And I want to hedge a minute on my response there, because there's been quite a bit in the chat again about racism of one sort or another, and it's hard because some critiques of higher ed is that higher ed is starting to fail us because it's gotten too liberal, too touchy-feely. I think we've got to find the right way to explain why we have to push for equity, inclusion. You can pick your word, why there needs to be cultural and structural shifts. I think the push for remote learning is making us wrestle with some of that in new ways, interesting ways. How do I connect with different kids? How do I offer things that are going to work for them? All of this starts to swirl together. I think online learning puts more burden on the student. You can do a lot with the technology that's out there, but the student has to be willing and want to digest the material, work with it, and so on. And I don't want to just say it's on the student and we're going to do it within the existing systems and so on. We have to be sensitive to what the students are able to do, what they have the time to do, what they have the money, so it gets really, really complicated. I'm enjoying the challenges. I don't have real short-term answers for you.
No answers, huh, Hart?
Sorry.
Let me jump in on the from like I think you asked about like remote work and remote.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
on a positive side, I think there's some opportunity. What is that? Never waste a good crisis. So there's opportunity, I think, in the expansion and acknowledgement of remote work right now. I say that meaning individuals that may not have access to jobs all over the world, or didn't think about that, could live in Southwest Washington and have those jobs, no matter what they may be. We're doing some work right now with a group out of San Francisco called Career Karma, specifically looking at diversifying the technology sector. And those are a lot of online jobs, potentially remote work jobs that could provide access to a number of individuals. I also want to, so like two pieces here. You're absolutely right. I weld at home and I wouldn't pass as a welder anywhere. I wouldn't, don't put my welds on a bridge. Let's put it that way. But you're right. There are certain jobs, and many of them really good paying jobs, that you have to be done in person. And I don't want to lose sight, like the Federal Reserve also just released their latest statement. I just want to quote that for a second. The path of the economy will depend significantly on the course of the virus. The ongoing public health crisis will continue to weigh on economic activity, employment, and inflation in the near term, and poses considerable risks to the economic outlook over the medium term. So my point here is to what Dr. Hodges, I think, was alluding to: wear a mask. We need to fight the virus first. All this depends right now on us beating and getting this thing under control. State budgets are important, policy concerns are important, all of this is critical. But we got to deal with the virus first. We can't put people back to work in person the way that we used to until the virus is under control, period. And so that continued viral issue that we have also puts a tremendous amount of strain, not just on the student, but on the family, right? I'm here, I've got a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old in my home. And thank God I have a 5-year-old and 7-year-old. And thank God that I'm fortunate enough and acknowledge that I have the privilege to have a job that lets me do this and be a dad and a cook and a cleaner and all the jobs that are traditionally done by K-12 education, and allows me to work. But the amount of strain that's being put on families right now to keep a job at home, and then to ask them to consider, like, if they've lost their job, to take training, to do training or some sort of like meaningful education online while, working with young kids, that's an incredible challenge. And it goes back to, we need to fight the virus and get it under control. Like the sooner we get that done, the faster we can get this economic recovery going. And there's a component of childcare here. It was already a problem before. It's just been exploded right now. Not only can you not provide childcare in person in really safe, holistic ways right now, but the availability of it and the cost of it is just astronomical. Somewhere on the average of $1,200 to $2,000 a child for one kiddo. So that all relates to this opportunity. So I think there are, as I said, opportunities in the crisis, but real challenges right now when it comes to families and adult learners and their ability to take advantage of whatever we could cook up on the higher ed side. But look, I just wear a mask, folks. Stay home, stay isolated as best you can. This fall is going to be critical for our economy. There's no question about it. I think if you look at any of the reasonable research around the public health sector standpoint, flu season, all of this, we got to remain vigilant here.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. All right, I'm going to hand it back to Patricia or Thomas. I'll let you argue over which one of you to respond to COVID-19. And then I think we also got another question that Patricia will respond to.
So I'll start and Patricia will go. We've reached agreement on that. So following on Kevin's remarks, obviously he's absolutely spot on. The economy follows the path of the virus. We have countries in the OECD like Australia and New Zealand that have done a really brilliant job of managing, and they're able to continue much more economic activity than our other countries. So you're absolutely right. I mean, that needs to happen. The larger picture on the sort of the equity impact of this is alarming. I mean, if you look at the research on learning losses among school students, children of color and children from whose families have less schooling and and who may have less capacity to support their learning are suffering the most here. In the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen data from the National Student Clearinghouse on the fall enrollments, right? And we can see that there's been a really clear decline in fall enrollments among Hispanic and Black males especially, right? So it starts at the schooling, it works its way through to the matriculation into higher education. And as Hart was acknowledging, we have some really serious problems, and these are across the OECD. We just met with the European Student Union. They've done a survey of their student population. There are really serious problems, those of equity in a digitized learning environment. As Kevin was emphasizing, partly that's a gender problem because the burdens of care all across the OECD have fallen disproportionately to women, and that creates very special problems of learning. But as the European Student Union pointed out, and I can share the results of that with you, there are a lot of students who struggle to have reliable broadband access, to have safe and quiet places to be a student. That can't be taken for granted. And then there's the question, as Hart said, of sort of how the learners interact with a digitized learning environment. And we know from what little bit of sort of experimental and quasi-experimental research is out there, and Brookings has shared some of this, that students with kind of with weaker learning skills or less advanced academic preparation really struggle in a fully digitized learning environment. They do significantly better in terms of measured learning gains in an environment where they have more like hybrid learning experiences, I mean, what it means in the short run is that institutions have to be really focused on the fact that they're serving learning populations who are coming to them with these circumstances at home. And they have to think about what that means for assessment, the scheduling of the kinds of assignments they're giving to their students, right? And how they fit into the lives of their students. And they have to think about the kinds of ways in which students are interacting with a digitized environment and what they need to do to put in place kind of the learning communities and supports that some of their learners are really, many of their learners are going to need. And it's not just a question of, well, we're thinking about this in terms of race. I mean, to Hart's observation about the institutions being faulted for sort of their political identity, I would imagine that young working class white men in, what is it, Grays Harbor? Is that the name of the county over, right? I mean, are faced with many of the same kinds of challenges, or Okanagan County, as would be the case for students of, Native American students in Yakima. In the long run, those are policy questions. In the short run, in the urgent term, those are questions that instructors and institutions need to deal with just to get us through the immediate term. Patricia, sorry.
I'll just add a couple of thoughts here on this discussion. One of the aspects I think that we are observing is the question of how online learning, which is a requirement in COVID times, precisely to try and get the epidemics under control, how is this going to be not damaging equity, which we've been talking about right now, but also how can it be done properly in some fields of study where you normally need to be face-to-face. And somebody in the chat actually mentioned that there are some new immersive technologies that are being currently developed to try and help people essentially using virtual reality or others learn skills that they would normally do in an actual classroom. The problem is that first, those technologies are not very widespread at all. It's very incipient. And then the other is that it's precisely in those fields of study that tend to have good, potentially good labor market outcomes that tend to be shorter, and that may also be the kinds of pathways that students of color may choose. And we see that as a kind of access way into the higher education sector. And if those vocational pathways cannot be done online, it's also another concern that I think we should care about. And I think this is one of the areas where continued progress in the pedagogies for practical and vocational fields need to really be taken into account just as much as the elements of student support. How can we ensure those pathways don't end up simply not delivering anymore during this current time period? I think we've talked a lot about the COVID impact, and I think, again, like Thomas has said, our thoughts from an international perspective, this is shared all across the OECD countries. So I just like to pivot here to another question that somebody asked in the chat, which has to do with social capital. I think actually all of this is connected. So somebody asked, how can we support social capital for disadvantaged students? And what does that really mean in terms of support? And I think here, we don't have the full answer to that. We would love to have it. But I think, again, the work-based learning, and we have to rethink what it means in a remote environment, but the work-based learning certainly is the one way that we know from research it's associated with actual ability to enter the labor market and meet the needs of employers and move around in your career more fluidly. Kevin mentioned that. I mean, again, we all had opportunities to make those connections, and actually adding good quality work-based learning can be your step to the first job. In some countries, it's much more embedded across all fields of study, the work-based learning opportunity, and it's defined, so it's a quality opportunity. It's not some internship that doesn't really connect the student to the employer. And I think the quality of the work-based learning, the availability of it, and making sure that all students take advantage of it, because again, the research that we have is that often disadvantaged students participate less in work-based learning. This is where we really insist, and this is one of the reasons we talked about the work study program, because this was actually meant to be towards students who are low income disadvantaged, but it shouldn't be just about making them money to pay for school. It should also be about connecting them with employers that then can give them that first step. So I think social capital is certainly acquired in part through the opportunity to be in the workplace. And that's one of the areas we think is very important. Just what I wanted to add on the social capital.
So I think we have time for one last question. And I will, unless I see a hand raise or a new chat come in and somebody interrupts me, I will take the liberty of posing this last question for you all. So I want to end with the future beyond wearing the mask, as Kevin said very clearly. You know, the OECD, your presentation today offered some very clear recommendations for Washington, but you also worked with a few other states. If you take the recommendations offered for Washington and consider some of the areas that other states have already maybe done some of these things, could you just offer a little bit of context around what is, maybe considering the context of a looming budget crisis and considering all of the assets that Washington does have, kind of what is most feasible, or maybe what emerges as like the area of focus to leave everyone here today to say, here's what you know, you can do in your community, or here's an area for higher ed to consider. What would be your kind of final focused recommendation, and kind of putting it in context of where we compare with the other states? So I'll hope Patricia or Thomas again can argue over whose response first.
I can take it, and Thomas, you can follow if you'd like. Well, that's a very good question, and I think that you'll have some of the answers in the third chapter of the report, which I'll all encourage you to read. I just want to say you will all get the PDF of the report. I know you can get it online right now. You can only read it, but you'll get the PDF. So I encourage you to look at that. But I mean, it was really interesting to compare those four states. You know, they are extremely different, but they struggle with similar problems. And some of them have taken the lead in having what I would call a more coordinated approach. And I think that's where Washington can probably take some interesting insights. I think Washington was one of the states where the most impressed in terms of the dedicated commitment, in particular in terms of financing and student financing. This is really an area where you're a leader. But when it comes to coordination and perhaps working more intensively between government authorities, institutions, and employers, I think there are some lessons that might be useful to learn. So I'll take the example of Virginia. So Virginia is the one state amongst the four that has what we call institutional compacts. So why we think that's useful and interesting to look at Virginia is, first of all, because they've done quite well in terms of both attainment, which is a key ambition that you have, and recently as well in sort of boosting labor market relevant supply. And what is interesting about the notion of compacts, which you might be able to explore, is just having a more ongoing relationship between state authorities and institutions. And back to what was said before, maybe also in using that process to engage faculty, to go, you know, to go beyond just the kind of leadership of institutions and try to engage faculty as part of a regular process. What programs do we offer? Are they relevant? Who benefits from them? Are students who are disadvantaged actually able to participate in, let's say, work-based learning? So compacts could be a way of communication, and they don't have to be attached necessarily to major financial consequences, which there are in some countries. They don't have to be, but a first step might be a good communication tool between state authorities and institutions. So I think that is something that Virginia does quite well. The other example I think we can take is where Washington might be able to learn from is Ohio when it comes to credit transfer and articulation. So Ohio has done a lot of great work trying to really have statewide credit transfer opportunities from the 2-year to the 4-year sector in a way that essentially the idea is you transfer. If there is a reason not to, then the institution is basically having to kind of explain. But there's this kind of concept, which is the burden is not on the student. It's like simplify the pathways. If there is a reason for asking for this extra course, it's always possible. Institutions are autonomous, but there's always this idea that like the student has a kind of, you know, kind of default option to maybe have clear pathways. So I think Ohio is a good example. And I'll finish with Texas, because we can't forget our great state of Texas, which has a lot of interesting, incredible things going on, very innovative practices. But I think most recently, what we found really interesting is that a strong awareness of state authorities, that there's a need for state agencies in charge of education, higher ed, and workforce to work together, but not to work together, you know, we can say we work together, but not do it in practice. So that's what we found on the ground, talking to staff in those state agencies, that, you know, we're supposed to collaborate, but in reality, we all have our targets. And, you know, my education targets is different from your workforce target. And what they did is that they're trying to figure out what kinds of statewide targets they can work together on so that everyone has the same goal. And I think that's something that is quite new. They started to create a sort of initiative, a tri-agency initiative in 2016, but they are sort of beefing it up now. And they are now actually focusing in the COVID time to really having those three agencies work together towards credentials of value in the labor market. So that's something that they're all trying using their different tools, the different segments of the system to collaborate on together and achieve progress. So yeah, lots of useful insights, I think, from other states. But I will say, though, that we were very impressed by Washington, and we've been using your state as a great example, not just to the other states, but also to our other OECD countries. So yeah, it's been also a great learning experience for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Patricia. Well, folks, we are at about 10:30, so I'm going to wrap us up here and just ask for everybody to do a round of applause in your own room for our wonderful panelists, Patricia, Thomas, Kevin, and Hart. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all of our attendees. It is a rough time that we live in. There is so much going on, and really appreciate you all taking the time to join us for this important conversation this morning. This is our last Pave the Way virtual session for 2020. If you have not signed up for the Pave the Way listserv to be notified about future events, we ask that you do that. Maybe Crystal, you can chat that in. We will be releasing and announcing our Pave the Way sessions for 2021, which will continue to be virtual. So we hope to see you all in 2021. Thank you all again, and wear your mask. Take care.